Hello, and welcome to another week of the Storied Arcs podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we are concluding our Loeb-Sale month with our discussion of Spider-Man Blue, which, great news for any listeners who are feeling uneasy, perhaps after the last thing. I will say my review of it has improved substantially compared to my first reading, although my problems are still problems. But I think we should probably talk about what's great first.
Okay, all right.
Sure. And I suspect we'll agree on it. But.
Yeah, okay, probably so. I mean, I think, as we've done in all the three prior episodes for talking about the works of Loeb and Sale, the first thing we've done is discuss a little bit of like what was going on with the character in the regular continuity of publishing. I think it's worth remembering, and I don't know if we mentioned this much last week when we talked about Daredevil Yellow, and I don't even know if we discussed it much in the Zero episode in general, but it's important to remember that in the early aughts right here, when Daredevil Yellow comes out and then Spider-Man Blue right after that, Marvel's still only a couple years out of declaring bankruptcy. Like they're only a couple years out of almost being out of business entirely, of having sold off assets. The one story I always remember that Brian Michael Bendis had been hired right at that point in the late 90s, early aughts, and he's in the Marvel bullpen, like the famous Marvel bullpen. He's working there. And as they're working on books and scripts, movers are hauling away office equipment because Marvel was selling like the fixtures on the wall. Like they were selling everything off. And they had a moment right there where they thought that they could legitimately be writing the last Marvel comics ever, because that's how bad it was. Then, things started to turn. They restructured. They sold off their most important characters to Sony and Fox, Spider-Man and X-Men. They launched the Ultimate line. Things got better. The Marvel Knights Initiative in the late 90s. Things got better, and now Marvel is on top, and they've been on top for the past at least almost 15 years, maybe, where they're the number one publisher. They've reclaimed that spot now, but it was iffy in the late 90s there. So we're coming out of that era in the early aughts when Spider-Man Blue comes out. As a reminder, it was 6 issues running from July 2002 to March 2003. So, there are some gaps there. I think there's some gaps there towards the end in terms of like it wasn't a strictly monthly book there. But, coming out, a number of things are going in Spider-Man's way at this point. In the main Amazing Spider-Man title, I believe either right before or right after Spider-Man Blue comes out, the Amazing Spider-Man is being done by J. Michael Straczynski and John Romita Jr. J. Michael Straczynski, people may know from like Babylon 5. John Romita Jr.
writing Captain America, right?
Yeah, I think he's Captain America. He's done a bunch of stuff. He has a whole series of stuff over at AWA. Tons of comic stuff. He was writing Amazing Spider-Man with John Romita Jr., the son of John Romita Sr., one of the great legendary all-time Spider-Man artists. They had just taken over, and they would start like a big massive run, which is a great run. Look back now, I'm sure it's collected. I'm pretty sure you can get an omnibus of like Straczynski and Romita Jr., like all the Spider-Man stuff there when they took over. But what's interesting about their run is they introduced a bunch of characters and laid a bunch of groundwork that in that 12, 15 years later, and now almost 20 years later, has become wildly important because they've been incorporated back. Characters like Morlun, the Inheritors, the idea of Loom World, aka Earth 00, Saharthra, Ezekiel Sims, the entire idea of the Spider-Verse, which Dan Slott and company ran with in like 2014, 2015, which then spawned all the Spider-Verse movies, the animated movies, and like quite literally, I think like a dozen or so various comics and events. And there's been Spider-Verse and Spider-Geddon and like Spider-Verse 2, the end of the Spider-Verse. There's a new book now that is called Spider Society. So the idea of a multiverse of Spider-Man and every world having a spider totem was all pulled from the ideas that Straczynski and JR put in in Amazing Spider-Man in the early odds. So it wasn't as big at the time, but said 10, 12, 15 years later, as creators look back on things and start pulling those ideas forward, the genesis was all there. So, Amazing Spider-Man, I mean, generally always does well because it's Amazing Spider-Man.
Right. It's one of those where it's like, doesn't matter if they have chairs in the Marvel office or not.
Yeah.
People are going to buy Spider-Man.
It always, and I was shout out to my brother here. We were talking after we talked about Long Halloween, and he did mention that sales of Batman are the generally accepted barometer for sales of a comic, like how much Batman sells, because Batman is Batman. But Spider-Man, why maybe it doesn't sell as much. Amazing Spider-Man doesn't sell as much as Batman does. Spider-Man is like the most profitable comic book character of all time across all media. Like,
yeah.
In terms of
the video games and the
video games, movies, TV shows,
yeah,
sales overseas and all of that. He is the most profitable character by like a large margin. It's not even close. So Amazing Spider-Man's always doing great. Also at this point, the Ultimate Universe is a year and a half in, almost 2 years in, and Ultimate Spider-Man with Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley, it was incredible, reimagining Spider-Man for a new age. So you had that going for it. And 2 months before Spider-Man Blue #1 comes out, the first Sam Raimi movie dropped.
Yeah.
So you had the Tobey Maguire,
which
Kirsten
was just
Dunst.
like a whole new vistas of audiences.
Absolutely.
Like,
so
I think more than Sony could have ever imagined.
I would have to
if
imagine.
they got everyone who'd ever read an ASM comic to go see the movie, they would have made the money they expected.
Yeah.
The fact that I went and saw it twice in the theater as
I don't
a
even
middle
know how many times I saw it in
schooler,
theater.
and I had
Jesus.
I've never seen anything Spider-Man before, never read a book. Just everything I knew about Spider-Man was in that movie, and I loved every second of it.
Well, and I think it's an interesting comparison to what we've talked about in the 3 previous discussions. Long Halloween has become the basis for a lot of the more recent Batman adaptations, whether it's Batman Begins, Dark Knight, Matt Reeves' The Batman, whatever it is, that they've looked back on that and have used it as text. Daredevil Yellow, we mentioned that Charlie Cox, the actor who was now, he is Matt Murdock now, whether or not they're actually adapting Daredevil Yellow, he uses that as a source text to get his mind right into who the character is. We talked about Superman for All Seasons, how it hasn't been adapted, but all the signs from James Gunn and Peter Safran are leaning towards it's going to be a heavy influence on the upcoming Superman movie. Which, depending on when you listen to this, if it's many years in the future, maybe we're proved entirely wrong. But right now, as we're talking, they've hinted at All-Star Superman and Superman for All Seasons as being inspirations, maybe not story and plot wise, but maybe vibe wise and feel wise. So all 3 of those books have since become a kind of fundamental base for adaptation because they're looking back on the early days of the characters, that they become like the new source text, the new canon, or the new presentation of canon for people then to adapt on. Spider-Man comes out, the first Sam Raimi movie comes out, and it's in production, obviously, years before Spider-Man Blue comes out. And so it doesn't have that impact in terms of people going back to it and adapting it, because the adaptation's already out there. A great adaptation at that. Again, Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 are phenomenal movies. Those first 2 Sam Raimis. And so, if you're into Spider-Man, a lot of people are at this point here in what, mid 2002 or whatever, like there's a flood of great content, whether it's multiple different types of comics. You got the movies. Spider-Man is now number 1 because of the movie, because of how good and how well received that first Spider-Man movie was. Spider-Man was on top of the world. And
I would think at this point,
right
you're also probably like having some of the, like, Batman's obviously a staple. He's always going to be Batman, but you're probably having some drop off from the Joel Schumacher. Like, you're not picking up the casual fans for Batman.
Well, yeah, that's right.
So, and it'd been a few years.
Batman and Robin was 97, 98, something like that. So it had been a while.
Yeah,
And
and
then it
you
was
didn't get
like
another one until oh
05,
05. Yeah.
oh 05 for Batman Begins, right? So
And
there's
Batman
a
Begins
lull
was
there.
pretty under the radar, as I recall.
Well, and when it came out, it was big, but so it's not happening right now. So in this moment, you had the first X-Men movie, which was maybe 6, 8 months before Spider-Man, I believe. That was like 01, I think it was, maybe 2001, something
I
like that.
didn't I didn't see any of those X-Men movies until
Oh,
they
okay.
were all out
Well,
of theaters.
so in this time, there was when those initial characters that Marvel had sold off to help get themselves afloat, Spider-Man and X-Men, their two biggest, most important properties, started coming out, and those initial movies were fantastic. So if you were then going to pick up Spider-Man Blue, and you were a Peter Parker fan, you were somebody who read and was into Spider-Man. I mean, this is coming out at an incredible time for the character. So I don't know how much it was at this point now. Loeb and Sale are a known quantity. They're people know who they are. I remember when I was just getting back into comics, it was just after Spider-Man Blue had been collected in trade, because it finished up in early '03, and that's right when I graduated college. So somewhere in the next 8 to 12 months, when I would have moved out, got my own place, and started buying comics again, was right around the time when Spider-Man Blue comes out in trade initially, like a first print. And it was part of the wave of stuff that I got because I was told to pick up, Long Halloween and Dark Victory and all that stuff. So I was like, oh, I know these guys. I know these creators. I like Tim Sale's art. And so, as I think I mentioned last week, I read this before I read Daredevil Yellow because I like Spider-Man more than I like Daredevil. So I came to this book very, very shortly after it was initially released in trade. So, about a year or so after issue 1 came out. This had been like late '03, maybe even like early '04, something. But I read it, and it was, like for a complete self-contained Spider-Man story. Like I absolutely loved it. And I think it does color a little bit of my feelings towards the book because there was so much good feeling going around in that moment around Spider-Man. It was riding so high in pop culture. And then I got this book from two creators that I was still learning what my taste was and what I liked, but I knew I liked these guys, you know? And I got a
Right.
book like this that told an incredible story from a perspective you didn't really get. Because I think the big thing that sets this book apart, and maybe why some people don't like it as much, is that um like we talked about with Batman's a very internal character, but we're not used to getting his inner monologue a lot. And Long Halloween doesn't really have that in the way that the other three books do, because that is a bit of an outlier. Superman, we talked about, that book is presented of how other people see Clark Kent, because that's the importance of Superman. He's a symbol. So it's not about what he thinks about himself, it's about what he means to other people. And then when we get these into the Marvel Colors series, Daredevil, Matt Murdock, we're now all in his head now, which we get a lot of now. The way we understand Daredevil now, really coming out of like the mid '80s and starting with Born Again and Frank Miller and Dave Mazzucchelli, is we get the tortured Catholic inner monologue. That's like the default setting for Matt Murdock. And so getting it represented in Daredevil Yellow was not kind of out of the blue. When you read Amazing Spider-Man, you get a ton of inner monologue for Peter Parker, but it's not that deep because that's not who he is. Everything he says, either out loud or in his head, is meant to be quippy. It's meant to be corny. It's meant to be trying to be funny. It's meant to have levity to it. It's very rare that you get true, deep introspection from Peter Parker himself, because he knows that's just basically his defense mechanism. He doesn't do that. So if you read Spider-Man, you're getting a ton of internal monologue. That's part of the whole thing, him talking to himself. But you don't get this tone that Loeb and Sale put in this book, which is like true, deep level of guilt, introspection, depth. He's really trying to examine him, his past, and he's not doing it in a fun, quippy, light sort of way. And so in that way, this book is set apart from the other ways that we see Peter Parker, and it's obviously intentional. That's the whole point of what this color series ended up being, where you have a main character in some way record their thoughts and their feelings towards someone they loved who is no longer with them. In this case, it's Gwen Stacy.
Yeah. Well, with that, why don't we get into what we like about the book, what we what we're I don't know if you even have any criticism. I know it's an all-time favorite for you.
Yeah, not a lot of Chris. I really don't. I don't.
But I have
really,
to say,
yeah.
I think this time I was critical of my own criticism, and I think I'm the problem. So like where I'm going to end this episode is by saying that I do get the sense this is a really nice love letter to ASM readers of a long time, and I do not think I would recommend this to a new Spider-Man reader. So like,
I don't think
like
about
Batman, Batman Long Halloween, I would give that to someone as their first Batman book. Superman for All Seasons, I would give that to them for for their first Superman book. Daredevil Yellow, not as much. Spider-Man Blue, not as much. So that's interesting. As soon as we go to Marvel, it it it's still the essence of the character. Like all four of these books are really boiling down. Here's the essence of like who this character is, what makes them tick, what drives them. But Long Halloween, Superman are kind of like introductions to the character in a way, whereas Daredevil and Spider-Man Blue are, hey, remember when this happened? Remember this, and like they're like the Venn diagram of overlaps between these four books is wild, because I would say obvious similarities to Yellow. I would say the similarities to Superman for All Seasons is that this kind of recaps kind of classic story beats. I don't really think there's like that much of a plot here. Like, I mean, it's not like about the story of the book. Again, it's about the emotional resonance.
Just like Daredevil Yellow. Yeah. It's the
well,
same
and just like Superman for All Seasons. It's like, what happened in the book? It's like, not really much.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Which makes, like we mentioned, Long Halloween the outlier, being that is a specifically designed mystery story. Yeah, here, these last three, I think you're right. It's less about.
However, this has in common with Long Halloween the Rogues Gallery. Like, you get, but in Daredevil Yellow, you really only get Owl, and in Superman for All Seasons, you really only get Luthor. Whereas this book, you get Kraven, Vulture, Rhino, Goblin, and so it's like, I mean, that's a lot for 6 issues.
I guess so. You're right about Yellow, although Owl is important there, but you see him fight Electro or the Shocker, which one it was. You see him fight the Matador, because again, that's recapping the villains he fought in Daredevil 1 through 6. And I have it here. They know Spider-Man Blue encompasses basically the run from ASM 40 to 48. Plus issue 63. Issue 63 is with the 2 vultures. So it's recapping those events right there. And I think they play with the timeline a little bit, because it's implied in Spider-Man Blue that like Kraven is behind all of this. That he kind of, push the ball down the hill and get things rolling, which isn't quite how it plays if you read ASM chronologically that way. But that's the time frame you're looking at, and you're right, you get all these classic characters, and it's just a matter of that's the stuff happening in the background of Peter's life as he is kind of re-examining his relationship with Gwen, and much like the way that Matt Murdock we talked about last week, is he's viewing with the idea of like, man, like what would your life have been like if you didn't know me,
right?
How your life changed and thus ended simply because you knew me, not because you knew Spider-Man, but you knew Peter Parker, me, the person. And I think we should say that last week it was Matt Murdock writing letters, to Karen Page. Here, Peter is in his attic and he's using a tape recorder,
right?
Which is.
We'll explain. We'll put a reference, a link to a Sony Walkman, or wait, what's
wasn't even that. It was
one from Home Alone 2. But it was like a proprietary thing.
Yeah, like the talkback thing. Yeah.
God, what was that?
He recorded a bunch of voice memos. That's what he did, except they were on physical media. That's what he did. Talk boy.
Okay.
I thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, he has an old school tape recorder and he's recording each one of these issues is him recounting his history of both fighting as Spider-Man and dealing with his friends, him, Harry, MJ, Flash, Gwen, all of that, the time when they met and those early days and what it was like. And as he re-examines all of that through the fact that now Gwen is dead. Worth noting again at this point, Gwen Stacy died in ASM 121, 122, which was 1973. So almost 30 years before Spider-Man Blue #1 came out.
Yeah.
We're up past 50 years now as we record this. So, so from publication wise, long time ago in the sliding time scale of Marvel Comics, actually, I have no idea how many years it's supposed to be in continuity. It's probably like let's see, at this point in the story, he's married with the Mary Jane. They don't have any kids though, so at this point, it might be like 6 years. Legitimately, it might be like 5 or 6 years in the sliding time scale of Marvel, but 30 years of publication history from when that happened. So
Yeah, I was like, I really would try to wrap your head around that.
well,
It's a moving
it is.
target. It's really.
It is. It is interesting though. I recently read a book that was published a handful of years ago. It's called All of the Marvels. It's by Douglas Wolk. He went and read every Marvel comic in main continuity because one thing about Marvel is that they've never reset their continuity. Marvel 616 universe has never been reset. They've had alternate universes and things of that nature, but it's the longest like continue running story. And so he read something like 27,000 comics to encompass all the characters, and each chapter he kind of breaks down and walks through each main character and or kind of groups of characters, and he tries to work through the continuity issues and the idea of the sliding time scale and all that. So there actually might have been a note in there about how long it's been since Gwen Stacy died in Marvel time, because he still gets bit. Peter gets bit as a kid in the 60s, but yet as he still is growing, he's now just like barely 30, and yet the world around him has changed to reflect our world with technology and things of that nature. So yeah, the sliding time scale, it's a comic thing, but it's been much longer for readers than it has been for the characters, which is in direct opposition, as we talked about last week, when Matt Murdock is writing to Karen Page, who in both publication history and in comic continuity timeline history only died like a year or two prior. It had only just happened a few years earlier, versus here where the death of Gwen Stacy has had a time to happen and have a reckoning and an understanding and work your way through it. So to go back to that now, to go back to it and revisit it,
Right. Yeah, because you get
bold.
You get the sense that he's like not choked up and weeping as he records these. He's very emotional.
Yes.
But it's not like a fresh wound. It's put a certain very specific and very intentional amount of time behind it, where it's like not over it, but it's not hitting the same way it does, initially.
Which I think some criticism about it is that the idea of that this is it's well trod territory in terms of what's been done around Gwen and the death of Gwen Stacy, and not only that, I mean, I mentioned the issues that this covers. It includes some of the most iconic moments in the literal history of comics, including ASM 42, which is the introduction of Mary Jane Watson. These guys had the audacity to
reintroduce her,
to replicate one of the 5 most iconic panels in the history of the medium. I have no problem. That's not hyperbole. I think Face It, Tiger, you've hit the jackpot. It's top 5, and it may not be that may be even too much. And so for them to have a level of audacity saying we're going to reimagine that scene, and retell that story in a way, And well, I just reframe that story in a way to present it in this book. And not only that, they homage a number of other really important, John Romita Sr. Moments there, where you're talking like the two vultures there. Later in issues 4 or 5 or whatever, when Spider-Man saves Flash Thompson and he's got him under his arm as he's swinging through, like that's amazing. That's Amazing Fantasy 15, which is one of the most parodied Spider-Man images of all time, comic images of all time. So they they are making these intentional homages and callbacks to, again, some of the most classic Spider-Man moments, which then make the most classic comic moments of all time. So I can see how some people, and I've read some of that, how they don't like the reinterpretation, they don't like the reimagining, they don't like going back over this ground again, when they feel so much time has passed. But I think for me as a reader, I like the examination that Peter goes through. Um, I like seeing that in the character, from a character we don't normally see. And because obviously I don't have the connection to the original ASM run, it's stuff that
It sounds like you've read it though.
absolutely. I've gone back and read, classic Spider-Man, because, it's available, whether it's Marvel Unlimited or whatnot, the library or whatnot. Yeah. I make it a point to go back and read
Marvel
classic
mostly Unlimited. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the important stuff, the important characters are there, and it's available. You can get, various collections and
Yeah, it's like Epic
omnibuses and all that.
Collections now and
Yeah.
And
So I've read all that, but that's all after the fact. And after, definitely, I've read Spider-Man Blue. This would have been stuff I've reread in the past 20 some odd years. So because I have no initial connection to those stories, maybe it hits differently then. But for someone who just enjoys the character, who loves the character, um, seeing a different side of it here. And I think also, again, it comes down to, I especially love Tim Sale's art. I mean, the first time I met Tim Sale at a Comic-Con, at a show, I had him sign all 6 issues of Spider-Man Blue, so I have him on all 6 of those, the entire run. I have him signed because I wanted him to sign on all of them. Couldn't pick just one, couldn't just have one. I wanted to have the entire series. So it's how much I love this book, more so than I think I actually love Spider-Man as a character. And I love Spider-Man. I love Peter Parker. I have been reading Spider-Man for years. But there's something about this book, this presentation, whether it's because of the creators, because of the framing of the story, there's something about this that connects with me. Could also be, again, the time I read it, when I was still early coming back into comics, when I really came back into comics as an adult on my own, choosing to come back in and reading. So there's a lot of factors, a lot of external factors probably that play into it. But this is my favorite Spider-Man story, and one of my favorite stories in comics, like, of all time.
yeah. I get that in hearing you say, like, oh well, in this panel, like, I had no idea Face of Tiger, you just hit the jackpot.
Yeah.
Was like a classic line, because, like, unless you go through the history of the character for a long time, how could you know that? And in 2001, I think that's a weirder thing to put in a comic book than it is in 1960 whatever. So I think it's one of those things where it sounds like some fans perhaps criticize it for, like, how dare you tread on sacred territory.
I think so.
Whereas
Yeah.
for me, I'm like, if you're gonna update it to make it less cringy. Don't just replay the cringe. And to me, that, like,
Well, okay, that's fair, but Face Tiger, you hit the jackpot. Like, no one thinks that's cringe. That's the thing. Like, that line is so iconic.
But
yeah. But that here is
you
the
can't
divide.
say no
between,
one in a 2-person podcast when one of us is saying it is.
Okay. Well, I'm saying, okay, this is where the divide, and when we started reading comics, and how we came into it, the eras and all that. Again, that is, you ask comic readers of, not even of a certain age, like that's a legendary scene, moment, and line. That is as famous as a Peter Parker line as "with great power there must also become great responsibility."
Right.
Like that, and it's just above, like, when Spider-Man throws his costume in the trash can, is like, I'm Spider-Man no more. Like, it's second only to to power responsibility, which is the most maybe iconic line in the history of comics. That Mary Jane reveal is like number two, and
Yeah,
yeah,
well, and
so
to be clear, I don't think it's cringe on its own. I think in the context of this book, the way that Gwen and Mary Jane are depicted. So like I've done a lot of thinking on this. So like I'll just rip the bandit off. Like my problem with this book the first time I read it is this notion that so like my impression is that Spider-Man has like a lot of the confidence and savvy and bravado and confidence that Peter Parker does not. True or false? At least, I mean, that's what like movie adaptations do, and I'm not a big Spider-Man reader. So my understanding was like there was always kind of the split thing, and I always thought it was weird in like the Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man that like oh he like could barely form a sentence and talk to people, but he's still a cool skateboarding hipster, and it was like I was kind of a weird spin, but I was like, I get it. They're doing something with him. So, but in this book, Gwen finds Peter completely irresistible. Peter has trouble or Spider-Man has trouble believing. He's swinging away. He's saying it was silly, really impossible. Gwen Stacy interested in me, but all of her speech is like loaded innuendo. She has nothing else to say as a character in this book, unless it's just blatantly hitting on Peter Parker, not Spider-Man, Peter Parker. Were you expecting that chemical reaction? She says, and then Mary Jane starts hitting on him from the very first line. Tells him he hits the jackpot. Says, see anything you like. She's just constantly flirting with him. They're immediately fighting over Peter. And as I was reading this book the first time, I was like, wait, is he a loser or not? Because it seems like all the other guys are jealous of him. They all want to be him. All the women want him. I'm like, this is, and yet he's still the nerd with the milk mustache in front of Aunt May, and a few pages later. So I was confused. So help.
Well, yeah. So Peter Parker is not a loser character. I think
Okay.
that's important there. Yes, he is a nerd. Yes, he has impaired social skills in terms of reading the room. He's not great with that.
Well, and there is that great line, like
yeah.
that. Okay, there's one quote that bumped it up a whole. Okay, he says just because I had a spider sense didn't mean I had common sense. I don't
Yes,
know if
yeah.
that's a classic line or if that's a Loeb-Sale original,
and
but gave it a whole extra star. I was like, that's great.
That is who Peter Parker is. He's not anonymous because I mean, he is.
He's not a wallflower.
Yeah, he is friends with
Henry and
with
Flash
Harry
and-
Osborn,
yeah.
who is the son of a very rich man, and friends, quote unquote, with Flash Thompson, who is like the popular jock and all that. So he's around these people. So yeah, he's maybe a little more socially awkward. He doesn't read cues very well, but yeah, he's not a loser. He has this responsibility, though. Again, the idea that it's just him and Aunt May, so he can't be as they don't have a lot of money. He can't be as frivolous. He can't go out as much. He can't hang around as much. So when he does, he doesn't like know what he is doing. But that doesn't mean in any way that he would be.
That he's not appealing to people.
Yeah.
Okay.
So his reticence for dating anyone is less about him not. It's more about him believing he doesn't have time to because he has to go to school, he has to go to work, has to take care of Aunt May. So for him, it's less like the idea of him being socially out there is like, well, that's another thing I got to deal with, and I can't because I got to go to school to help to try to get a better job than what I got because the job I got sucks, but I have to keep it because I have to pay the rent and help Aunt May. So he feels like all of his time, and then on top of that, oh wait, now I'm also Spider-Man. So so his awkwardness and reticence to some of that is less about, hey, not that I don't want to do this, but I don't feel I can do this because I have to do these other things. So yeah, it's not that he wouldn't be unappealing to someone.
I got you.
Yeah.
So,
and
but yeah,
he's also
but then
and also
you get
generally,
into the ridiculous trying to do the sexy soup feeding scene versus
when he's
the
sick.
sexy reading of Huck Finn. Yes, which by the way, she should not read that book out loud. There are,
you know what,
but
it was a 60s. It was a different time there. So yeah,
so anyway, but okay, but here was my spin, and I thought of this after I wrote my scathing review on Goodreads the first time I read it. I was like, wait, this is still all from a very young man's perspective.
Yeah.
And so him depicting this is Peter depicting both of these women in this way. Like, because I was like, I think it just feels a little too male fantasy for me. That it's like, oh, all the women love me, and every time they talk to me, I'm aloof, but they're flirting with me and they're trying to feed me soup and read me books and get on my motorcycle and do all this other stuff. And I was like, maybe like this is loosely what happened, but it's got the spin on it of like a young man who's a little full of himself.
Well, and I think this is where the action you're seeing that's happening, which is the recounting the early issues, is in, I don't want to say contradiction, or maybe in conflict with what what Peter's narration is about these scenes, what he remembers about them versus what's being said, as it's happening. There they're replaying the way that things were depicted, the way that the characters were written at the time, and then what I think what you need to focus on is what Peter is saying on the tape recorded message, which I should say right now, is different here than, we've mentioned the lettering in the previous books here. Peter's narration is not in a different font. The letterer here being Wes Abbott and Richard Starking is again, but they don't go to a mixed case, but they do go to a blue background for all of Peter's narration. But I don't know if I don't know if it's because it is spoken instead of being written, like in the previous books, with Superman for All Seasons and Daredevil Yellow. But there is no change in the font style here, which I thought was interesting, that they would keep it the same, that it's still in all capital letters, just they put it in a blue background. So I wonder why they made that choice, when they had when they made that choice, when they had made a different choice for their previous books. I wonder what the decision was as to why to make it that way. But going back on point here, I think where the focus is less on the actioning that's happening, which is in replaying the partying and the hanging out and the fighting the villains and all that, and really focusing on what Peter's reminiscing and reflecting on in his narration.
Yeah.
And I think there you see the perspective of a man versus the view of a boy, which I think you're right about. The actions that are happening are the viewpoint of a boy, but you have to read his narration as someone, as a man who has much more experience, who has lived and understands now, has a different perspective on kind of the things he did as a child, even though he's not that young. They're in college, but still, you're not that old in college. You're still a child.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. And so I think that as I start to grade it, so like, now I have a little more backdrop of like, okay, some of these are just recounting classic beats. And then some of these you have to understand we're getting from Peter's perspective. And in the same way, like, I think it's fair to read Daredevil as like, this is not necessarily an objective account of who Karen is. Like, I thought it was actually pretty strong. Like, she was not depicted as someone who was just like madly in love with Matt and was an innocent bystander and died. She was someone who like ran into trouble, did not always stay out of danger because she was her own person. And I think in this story, Gwen is kind of painted as like a helpless victim of like, if only I weren't so irresistible to her, this wouldn't have happened to her because she had no agency. And so I think that is the bump for me, but that's the story. Like, they didn't make that.
Yeah.
Like, Loeb and Sale didn't make that. They just, so that's my thing is I was like, I guess if you're going to revisit that, why not update it and make Gwen, which I think like, for the many, many flaws of Amazing Spider-Man 2, the movie, they did show like Peter is just like begging Gwen to leave. And she's like, no, I'm my own person. Like, I know what risk I'm taking and I'm doing this. It's not because I'm in love with you. It's because I'm a strong person. And like, they tried to respin it. And that wasn't why that movie didn't work.
Yeah, yeah.
But the movie didn't work.
It
So
didn't work, yeah. But
yeah.
it wasn't their
It
characterization of
wasn't the
Gwen that did it.
Gwen, it was the like everything else they try to do. It's like I just don't know why. I think the people they hired to make Spider-Man movies can like holster their excitement about Spider-Man IP for one, maybe two movies, but like it's just so tempting to be like, oh, but like I can't believe we're on our third movie and we haven't done, Sandman yet and second Green Goblin and like, it's like by the time Sam Raimi got to the third movie, it was like, well, we can't do a trilogy without doing Venom, but I really want to do the Sandman thing, and well, we can't just ignore the Goblin, so it's like just throw it all in there. And by the ASM franchise, it was like, I love Elektra, and and now you got to have Goblin in there, and it's just like, oh my goodness, guys, slow down. There's so much story to tell, and if you do this right, you can just do it forever.
Because everyone wants to get to Sinister Six. That's the whole idea. You want to get to
Right,
the Sinister Six as fast as possible. Whatever version of that you need to get to, but you need to get to six villains that somehow.
right. Well, and the question I would ask, at least a few years ago, I would have said this way: is, what would Feige do?
Yeah.
Feige, if Feige only, never had Marvel Cinematic Studios, all he got was like, you have the Spider-Man world. Let's say Sony made Kevin Feige their Kevin Feige.
Mhm.
I think you probably would have had between 4 and 6 standalone movies before you did a Spider-Man Sinister Six movie. Like, I think he would have been okay with the slow burn and pacing himself and like, let's get there, let's do it right, let's do all these characters justice, and let's take our time and savor the material.
If I got to be honest, I would love to think he'd want to do that. I don't know if he'd get the leeway to do that.
Yeah, I don't know if the studio would be cool
yeah,
with it.
I'm with you though. I think
He has
I
the,
think creators want to
impulse
do that
for it.
stuff. Yeah, they want to do that stuff, but like you're telling me we got to have six. So your star has to be in six movies before we have. I mean, like,
Right, we'll be paying him Robert Downey Jr. money before we even get to the thing we want to make.
yeah, that's six movies at that scale, at that level is, we're talking that he's going to star in, not like, hey, come back and do a cameo in something here. Like we gotta have like five Spider-Man movies before we get the Sinister Six. Like that's probably 12 years, more than that.
And I think that's why that's why
it
like
doesn't
Sony
happen.
has tried to like hotwire it by doing like,
Yeah.
well, what if we do like we'll do a Venom trilogy and maybe we'll sneak a few more of the Sinister Six in there. We'll throw Vulture in the end credits or something. It's like we'll just cobble it together by doing other movies to take pressure off the fact that we're not really making Spider-Man movies. And it's like, I don't know what you think the sales pitch is for watching Spider-Man verse stuff when you're not making a Spider-Man character movie.
Yeah.
Like, what am I supposed to get excited about?
Sony's
Venom
thing about
3?
Yeah, Sony's thing. Well, Venom is its own franchise. Venom has a built-in audience of people who like the Venom movies, but like the rest of them, the whole idea of like we're doing Spider-Man movies, they don't have Spider-Man in them, and we can't even say like Peter Parker Spider-Man. I mean, it is not going to work. It hasn't worked. Venom works because they have leaned into the ridiculousness of whatever Tom Hardy is doing. Like they just let him cook, and so that has found its own audience. But like again, Morbius was terrible. Madam Web was terrible. Craven is going to be terrible. Like, I mean, they're going to be bad. Because you have to have Peter Parker. He is so integral. I thought of something as we were talking, just it flashed on it to go back to the book I mentioned, All the Marvels by Douglas Woke. He mentioned something in there that I think I knew was like spiritually true, but Peter Parker, Spider-Man, is the linchpin character of the Marvel universe, the entire Marvel universe, in that every character he has interacted with every single character in the Marvel universe. Not everyone else has interacted with each other. So we talk about 6 degrees of 7 of Kevin Bacon. Everyone in the Marvel universe is 1 degree away from Peter Parker. He has interacted with every single character, apparently except for one, which is Millie the Model. But Millie the Model has interacted with Mary Jane Watson, who also spent time as a supermodel. So she's only 2 degrees away from Peter Parker. But every other character in the Marvel, so in order to be a part of the ongoing Marvel Universe story that's being told in comics, to basically be bona fide, you have to interact. At some point, Spider-Man's going to swing into your story. He's going to be there. You're going to interact with him, and that's how like you're rubber stamped. Yes, this is official, and that's the power of Peter Parker, and that's the reach that he has. There's a reason why when they do like the multiverse stories, the Spider-Verse stories now, it's all Spider-Man related. Just like over at DC, when they do the the evil and different versions of a character, it's always Batman, right? We're bringing multiple Batman in. We're bringing evil Batman in. Whatever it is, it's always around Batman. And then, oh, here's some other versions of other characters. Like they have, the different Justice League versions or whatnot. But just like they have in Marvel with their characters, but the main guy, the multiverse stuff is always Spider-Man because he's that important to Marvel comics and to comics. And so I think any re-examination of his stories, of his classic stories, always gets some pushback. And I do think there was a level of like, who are these guys to go back and retell these stories, or not even retell them, just represent them, again, to go back and say, we're going to redo the reveal of Mary Jane Watson, which, trust me, was a big deal. And is a big deal in comics. For them to go back and be like, I'm gonna put my own twist on this. It's like, how dare you go back and do this? And try to reach and try to put any sort of spin on it. No one should be able to do that. It's kind of held in that high of regard. So I think there's some guts and some moxie in that. And again, knowing the references but not having a connection to them is why I love this story. And maybe that's a generational thing, Maybe that's just when I came
not
through,
knowing
came up
the stories, not having the connection just makes you interpret it all as new story, and as if they're I know Gwen Stacy died. I know it's because she was dating Peter, Spider-Man, and that's basically it. I go into this book and I get what I thought was a relatively superficial, although probably a more than fair, accurate representation of 1960. And it has the same timelessness that Superman for All Seasons and Batman Long Halloween. Like, you can't quite pin what year this is supposed to be happening. Like, the men are all wearing suits, like cashly.
Yeah.
So it's like, this is clearly not the 80s, 90s, or 2000s.
Yeah. The flashback stuff happens, quote unquote, happens in the 60s. And then, it's not, but when Peter is, when they cut to current time and you see him in his attic, like when Mary Jane comes to talk to him at the end, like that's not happening in 2002. It might feel like it is, but it's, the actual time scale is different. What I wanted to ask you is, what is your history at all with Spider-Man as a character in comics? Because I think maybe you have more of a connection with Daredevil Yellow because you are a Daredevil reader. So you had read more, you do read more. So when you go back and read something like Daredevil Yellow that taps into early times of stories when you obviously didn't read and hadn't read, but you have more familiar with the character. What is your connection at all with Spider-Man as a character in the comics?
It is frankly amazing how little I've read, given that I absolutely adored all three Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies. It's like third one is a hot mess. I loved it. It was a hot mess and I loved it. ASM, I saw both of those movies. The Tom Holland Spider-Man, Ride or Die is the best trilogy in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like it's close with Cap. But I think
it's no lower than 3. Not even, it's probably no lower than 2. Yeah. So
yeah, I'm like, well, in terms of how many times they like stuck the landing and kept it at 3, because like that's the thing is like, well, now there's more than 3 Avengers movies, so it's not a trilogy.
Obviously, they cap it at 3, but like there's a Zero appearance in Civil War, and he's he's also integral in both Endgame and Infinity War. So but
right. No, but like, if you didn't watch other movies and you just watched those 3, even with all the other stuff going on in the Marvel universe, I think it stands on its own. So anyway, so I adore all those things. I love the Spider-Man, like the PlayStation games. which is like actual scale New York, is unbelievably cool. Great stories in there. You get to know like comic histories of classic Sinister Six as you go. And I'm like Googling as I play to like make sure like this is accurate and I'm not going to start operating in the real world with some Elseworlds version of, the character.
Uh-huh. In
And
the
then
Spider-Verse?
oh my God, I love like that's going to be like the best Spider-Man trilogy
Yeah.
where like unless they just totally botch it, which I can't fathom.
And that would take active effort, I think, to sabotage that.
Especially since they
Yeah.
made it at the same time as the second one. It's like,
Yeah.
right. If it's anything like the second one,
So what we're getting at is Spider-Man adaptations in media.
adaptations,
Yeah.
I love them.
You love it. But as a reader,
I went back and I got
I was going to ask how many
the big silver ones, Masterworks.
Masterworks. Yeah, I was going to ask how many comics how many issues, even if they're collected in an omnibus or a Masterworks, how many issues of Peter Parker Spider-Man main character comics do you think you've read?
Main continuity, I think I read like the first 18, like whatever's in the first 2 epic collections.
From the okay.
Which is I've been buying up. Every time they re-release the epic collections, I've been buying up Spider-Man ones because it is one that I want to read more of, and I want that like classic golden era. Like I want to know the roots of this character.
I guess at that point.
And now I'm
we're
reading
Silver
Ultimate
Age,
Spider-Man.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're reading the new Ultimate Spider-Man.
I'm reading the new Ultimate, which will
Hickman
just confuse
and Mark
hell out of
Sinchetto.
anyone who's like trying to get to know the real Spider-Man. But it's just like, my God, they got, it's a totally different Peter Parker.
Yes,
but they got Peter Parker. It's it's like he's always Peter Parker.
Well, and this is it is weirdly comparable to the original Ultimate Spider-Man, which is we're going to assume he gets bitten in the early aughts. And what is that? How do we lay these classic stories on? And it totally works. But so you haven't read. I was going to ask if you read any modern either Spectacular Spider-Man,
I do
Amazing
enough,
Spider-Man.
I do enough. What do they call it? Oh my God, like just talking to guys at shops. I was gonna the water cooler talk.
Yeah.
That like I know about like One Last Day, and I know about like it's like
One More Day
or One More Day. Yeah. It's like, and I know everyone's takes on those, and I love Jason Concepcion, the podcast host, who is obviously a big Spider-Man guy.
Yeah.
And for like his tree on binge mode where he got to talk about Spider-Man, and he goes into I forget what they call that section.
I know. Yeah.
There's like some vault thing where he goes for like 30 minutes and just nerds out and gives you like, this happened in ASM, this and this and this. And he's pointing out like, first of all, my favorite, I love in the MCU Spider-Man that like license plates on cars are always like ASM something
with a number or a year.
That's usually like an Easter egg for like, so when you see Donald Glover's character, it's the ASM where his character was introduced. And it's like,
yes.
God, that's clever. It's like, and it's so easy. But it's very clever. So anyway, it's one of those where I know what happens in them at some point. I need to just sit down and go through them.
You've never just really actually read it, even whether it's some of the classic stuff, but really none of the modern stuff, any of the thing from the past. Since you've been reading comics on a regular basis, you have not picked up an Amazing Spider-Man or any
spot issues. Well, you know what? When we had Humberto Ramos at Cincinnati Comic Expo, I did read like the first 10 of that run, which obviously I couldn't get in print. I was trying to find one to get signed, and but he's just the artist. Who's the writer of that?
Dan Slott was doing that.
That was before Zeb Wells was on it.
Well, Ramos
before and after.
Ramos he's a longtime recent Spider-Man guy. Depending on when you would have got it, because when he was on with Dan Slott in 2014 or whatever, that was the lead up into the original Spider-Verse event.
I got signed. So, but I did the kind of thing where it's like every issue is someone's first issue type thing.
Yeah.
where like I started picking up Ramos' Spider-Man,
Mm.
and I would pick up because I liked the cover. I was able to find it in print or something, and I would read that spot issue, and you can get a general sense for what's happening.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, because Spider-Man, because it is so long running, yeah, you can jump in and it's widely enough available, really, that you know you can find back issues if you want to fill stuff in. One of the issues that comes with a character like Spider-Man, because he's been around so long, random issues become key issues because all of a sudden, uh, 5, 10, 15 years later, an issue is now someone's first appearance who's now important. It's that kind of thing.
the one I
So,
had signed by Ramos was written by Nick Spencer in 2019,
oh, okay, okay, all
and
right, yeah. So,
it's
yeah,
like Craven the Hunter sitting on the throne
yeah,
with like Spider-Man's head on a mantle behind
okay,
him,
yeah,
and,
yeah,
and like and a lot of the Sinister Six.
yeah. Okay, so
It,
that, yeah,
it was a
so
really cool cover.
yeah, so Spencer took over in 2017, 18, something like that. He had a very long run.
That
He started his run started with Ryan Otley, and then you bring in different artists and all that. Ramos again had been the previous artist. He's also currently drawing the Spectacular Spider-Men, which is a really fun series, which is a team up between Peter and Miles, which is super super fun. Ramos is he's I associate him with Spider-Man, even though he does a lot of other work and a lot of other Marvel work. Like he helped co-create Strange Academy and things like that with Scotty Young. But I associate him with as a Spider-Man artist. But yeah, so you have no compunction or compulsion to like I want to read Spider-Man on a regular basis. That is not something that you have. So it's very similar to me when and Daredevil. Like
well, yeah,
I
okay,
yeah.
yeah, that's a fair comp because
Would
I
you
was like,
say that's comp?
I wouldn't say I'm disinterested. It's just one of those things. Like you and I were texting this week because I had read Spider-Man Blue before earlier this year.
Mm-hmm.
I read it again last week, and we had like 2 week gap between recording Daredevil Yellow and Spider-Man Blue. I took time to read basically one trade of comics per day that is not related to the podcast because I'm so frigging backlogged. Like I've got a shelf behind my couch, and when I'm not too tired at the end of the day after like my kid has gone to bed, my wife's gone to bed, I either have to choose between like turning on a movie or a show or something and just kind of tuning out, or sitting down and trying to tear through a trade of comics. So I've been doing that, and so adding another character and a one that I know I'm gonna go nuts for as soon as I get into it. So it's one of
Mhm.
those where it's like, oh boy, when I start reading modern Spider-Man, it's gonna get real expensive. It's
Yeah,
gonna get real expensive real fast because I'm gonna want all of it. And I like I have other exposure to the writers. Like I like Dan
yeah.
Slott, I like Nick Spencer. I like,
Mhm.
these they're not my like tier one writers, but like I respect them all very much, and I know the character's good. So it's
All right, so
yeah, it's just one of those where it's like the right writer, the right combo. What got me with Ultimate was I was interested to see what Hickman would do with it, but also it was a clean entry. And
yes,
I
yeah.
and I don't believe Marvel number ones anymore.
Yeah.
When it's like, oh,
Well,
it's Legacy 807 number one.
well,
And it's like it's not a clean entry point. It's just a random reset.
but then see, but here's the thing though, they are clean entry points because the assumption is you know who Peter Parker is. You don't have to know what came before, but you know who Peter Parker is. You know who Spider-Man is. And so it's a new story arc from a new team. So you can jump in and it doesn't matter what came before because the story is that they're telling is starting new. And so that they're at, I would actually say you're wrong about that because I've read through most of these resets and of reboots and all that. When it comes to a character, specifically a character like Spider-Man, every time there's a new number one, that's basically them just saying, "Here's a new creative team. We're going in a new direction with the story." But
That's fair. I mean,
you can pick up right there.
I
You could start at
think
any number one, whether it's Slots number one, where that he wrote, which he actually had a couple. Spencer number one, Zeb Wells coming in number one. I guess that's where we are right now currently. So it's a branding thing. Yes, it's a manipulate the sales chart thing. Yes, but it truly is like you don't have to have read what came before. We're starting new, and the assumption is just like with Batman, you know who Batman is. You know who the core of Batman is. There's enough pop culture around Batman that you can just start reading. Spider-Man is the same way. So you can jump in at any point. And and follow along on what this story is, and you know the general
I might have to take you up on
vibe.
that challenge because
Yeah.
uh
See,
like I joined comic reading during the New 52 and I was able to get my bearing, and then Rebirth came along and I was like, "Oh, hey, that, that's perfect for me. Like I get to do clean start with all these characters because I read the DC Rebirth one shot with Wally, and it really seemed like we're doing a hard reset on the universe. We're going to reintroduce every character with these one shot number ones, and then another number one, so that we get a bunch of 299 number ones back to back weeks. Anyway,
that was the whole thing.
like
Yeah.
the first thing was like the one shot, Batman
It
by
was
Tom
it
King.
was Batman colon Rebirth number one,
Right. Before you got
and then it was
Rebirth Batman number one,
that was Batman number one,
third
parentheses Rebirth.
series. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or whatever it is.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But anyway, like I picked that one up, and there was like stuff happening in the middle of it. And like I didn't know who the signal was. And it's, he's doing like one armed pull ups off the top of Wayne Tower talking to Fox. And like they're having a conversation that it didn't understand. And I was like, what is this? What is the kind of number one is this? But that was when I felt like I had to understand everything before I was allowed to turn the page. And I'm
Yes.
not that kind of reader anymore.
Yeah.
But I think that's the real learning curve with comics, regardless of the character or publisher or anything, is like
Yes.
sometimes you just have to say, I don't understand what they said or why they said it,
Yeah.
but I got that they said it. Next page.
Yeah, 100%. I think that is the attitude I think you have to have with a character, especially long-running characters. Whether you start with the number one or not, you have to accept the fact that things have come before that you're probably not going to know, and how important that is will be revealed to you as you. So if you read something and you don't know understand it, you're also not going to understand how important it is. You have to accept that, and you have to keep reading to see how important it actually is, and whether or not it's how big of a deal it is, and do you have to go back and read it, and is it just like, oh, I got to read the little editor's note, like see ASM, or 785 to 788. What do I have to go back and read that stuff? Is it important or not? You have to accept that there are things you're not going to. But I do believe with a character, not a character like Peter Parker, specifically with Peter Parker and Spider-Man, if you've never read any of his stuff, you pick up any volume number one, and you're going to know, you're going to be able to follow it. Even like the Dan Slott stuff, which is, it's so wild because like the Dan Slott stuff that started in like 2014 or whatever, that came out of Superior Spider-Man. Peter Parker had just had his brain swapped with Otto Octavius, and he just had his brain swapped back. And it's totally wild. And all of a sudden he comes back and he's the CEO of a multi-million dollar tech company, and you're like, if you haven't read any of that stuff, you're like, I don't know what's going on here. You just have to be able to accept it and go with it and say, this is what the status quo is. And then you see how it plays out from there. It's less important to know the specifics because you'll be told the specifics of what you need to know. And if you're not told that, then the creators aren't doing their job. If they don't give you the stuff you're supposed to know and highlight it in a way that makes it accessible, then those creators aren't doing their job. But I think with a character like Spider-Man, given your general knowledge of Spider-Man, I think you could start any of in the past, we'll say past 10 years, any volume one, which it could either be written by Dan
I'm going to
Slott,
take
Nick
you up
Spencer,
on the challenge.
I think you, yeah.
And I think the difference is I was thinking of it as like, we don't start with Lost season 3, number 1, when you want to get into Lost, right? You got to go back to the beginning. You got to watch it. But it's more like trying to jump in on Doctor Who. It's like, it's been going so long.
That's a much better. Yeah.
Yeah. You just have to find a soft entry point.
Comics are they're at one time, they are one continuous story, and they're also anthologies,
Yeah.
That everything
and
that's
each
before,
issue is its own story, or at least when it's a good writing.
Yeah.
Team.
So there is inherent contradiction in comics like that. So if you think of it only as one continuous story, I can never jump in the middle because This is going to be issue 900. So as recording right now, the next issue of Amazing Spider-Man is issue 950. Which means in a handful of years, they will be the next comic to naturally get to 1,000 issues.
And
Detective
possibly
Comics,
1,000 variants for that one. I mean, that one,
well,
legitimately, I think any artist alive will say yes to a variant for that.
Yes, yeah, it is lessened by the fact that they're getting like Detective and Action already got to 1,000. But this will be the first Marvel comic to legitimately naturally reach 1,000. So that'll be a big deal. Just like it was a big deal for both Detective and Action to get to 1,000. They did a bunch of obviously huge. They did a massive and
they were
prestige,
nice, right?
Yeah,
they did a nice job. They were good stories.
They were there were a collection of stories in there.
Earth shattering. They weren't trying to move the needle at all. It was more of an homage.
It's a celebration of the character. That's what they want to do. It was a celebration of the character. Bring back a bunch of different old creators. They'll do the same thing in a handful of years when Amazing Spider-Man gets there. I'm sure it'll be great. It does make me sad because I can guarantee you there would have been a Loeb-Sale story in that book. Like 1,000%.
There would have been a Loeb-Sale. If they have one tucked away.
I don't know. I don't
know.
There
might be even if there were unpublished Sale pages, I think Loeb could put together a 5-page script to lay over those pages.
I don't know. At most, I could think maybe they have an unused sketch, an unused
which
artwork.
Would be a variant.
That could be a variant cover. Yeah. Which again, I think that's what they're doing. I believe it's what they're doing for the Long Halloween follow-up, the last Halloween, the book that's going to be coming out currently. Yeah. I believe those covers, all the main covers, I think are Sale sketches and drawings that are being used in that way that he had done before he passed. So I would love it if something like that happened could happen with Amazing Spider-Man when we get to that point. But you never know, and it's only just wishful thinking. But I think because Spider-Man is that important, because Peter Parker is that important, he is that critical to the story of Marvel Comics. He's getting more so than any other character out there, any other franchise, more so than the Fantastic Four, more so than the X-Men, more so than all of that. Peter Parker is that character, and he kind of engenders that loyalty and that belief in him, which is why he's always, they always want to, Sony's never going to give those rights back,
right.
Fox at some point gave up. Well, I mean, they eventually sold the studio back to Disney, but Sony is never going to renegotiate that deal to where they lose Spider-Man. They never want to give up that property. They never want to give up those rights because Spider-Man is that important. Peter Parker is that important. He's that big. He's that crucial. Them having that is everything. And as long as they have that little bit over Marvel Studios and Disney, they're going to hold on to it.
Yeah. So anyway, before we started this Loeb-Sale month, my rating of Spider-Man Blue was 2 stars.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. I'm sorry. That's
after rereading it, which by the way, of my friend group on Goodreads, I was not the only 2-star review of that book.
Well, you need better friends. That's just what it comes
However, the comic guy I agree with the most gave it 4 out of 5, but he didn't write a review, and he always writes reviews. So I just wonder if he was just there's just no complaints, nothing to say about it, but it wasn't perfect. So 4 out of 5.
And I guess what your renewed number would be?
Yes.
I would say your renewed number would be somewhere between a 3 and a 4.
That's exactly what it is. It's 3.5.
So it ends up being 3.5. Yeah.
But if you could, Goodreads doesn't do the half, so I have to round up.
Yeah.
So prior to this discussion, I had rounded up to, I'd said it's a solid 3. And now I'm it's a pretty solid 3.5. Yeah. And, doing the quick reread. But here's another, and I'll keep him anonymous, but there's another friend of mine gave it 2 stars. He said, and this is, I think, represents the opposite perspective. He had none of the problems I had. He said, very disappointing. It's like an abridged version of some great Spider-Man comics, yet not even that great of an abridgment. End of review, 2 stars. And it was that. I don't think you understand what they're doing. That's like when people say that'd be It's like this people who give 2 stars to Superman for all seasons. They're like, didn't even cover any new ground. It's like, that's not what they're doing here.
Yes, I think that yeah, a review like that is missing the point. If you read this and you're like, wait, so what happened with Vulture? What happened with? If you want to know, go back and read the issues. Go back and read the original. This book isn't about that part. This book is about the coda at the end when Peter's in the attic, and obviously everything has this blue hint, this blue hue over it, like it's like a filter or something. And MJ walks in on him, and he's kind of like, how long were you listening? Long enough. And she ends by saying, just, hey, tell Gwen I said hi. Like she understands what's going on. She understands what Peter needs to do there. It all culminates into that. And what I think is interesting about this ending here is 2019, I think. We were just talking about ASM reaching 1,000 issues at some point naturally. I think I believe it was 2019, for an anniversary, for Marvel Comics anniversary, they put out an issue that's just called Marvel Comics 1000. That doesn't mean anything. It was a big anthology. It's a big celebration of Marvel. And it was a whole bunch of one-page stories. Okay. Where a creative team just came in and they took like an idea chronologically, like an event that happened, like a character was introduced in 1972. And then a team wrote a story, a one-page story about that character or something about that character. It was a very cool idea. It's an issue that I love a lot. And I believe the best stories out of that were all Spider-Man related. And one of the stories is a Mary Jane story. It is Mary Jane basically doing on one page what Peter Parker spent 6 issues doing here, where it is her recounting her quick thoughts on Gwen Stacy and running through their history when they met, and how the first time they met, Gwen was studious, went to school and all that. MJ was a party girl, and she said like Gwen saw right through that facade right away and whispered to her the first time they met, like, we're going to be best friends. And it ends at the point where like Mary Jane's aunt's being like, asks her one time, like, why did you stay with Peter that night? That night being the night that Gwen Stacy died. And Mary Jane responds saying, like, I didn't stay for Peter. I stayed for her. I stayed for Gwen because she taught me how. She showed me how, that I could be more, that I could do more, that I meant more. And it is an interesting spiritual successor to all of Spider-Man Blue, just to get this one single page of Mary Jane's perspective on the death of Gwen Stacy. That's kind of summed up in that one panel when she just says, hey, tell Gwen I said hi. And I like to think of that as a nice follow-up, because again, this is all about Peter and what his thoughts are. We don't get what MJ's thoughts are, even though she was there the whole time. She was there through all of it as well. So it's nice to get a different kind of perspective on that. But that's what this book is about. It's not about his battles with the various rogues gallery, So if your review is about that, then yeah, you have just missed the point. In which case, I don't care about your review, because if you don't like the narration that Peter gives, I can respect that. If you don't understand what he's talking about there and you don't connect with it, I get that. If your whole thing is like, I want to know what's happening in when he fights Rhino, when he fights the vultures and all that stuff, I don't need to listen to that, because that's not the book's about. The book's about the end here. It's about the way he comes to his understanding of his own life.
Yes, and I think it's really about, you have to respect what the authors are attempting to do. I think so. I'm trying to put myself back, when this came out. If I had read Long Halloween and that was like my Loeb-Sale exposure, and I found out they were doing Spider-Man, I would lose my mind. I'd be like, oh my gosh, is it going to be like the 13 oversized issues, a new original villain with like this epic tale, of world building and like exploration and getting to know the character, but also getting like a close look at other characters in the world. And then you get this. I think you would feel like the rug was pulled out from under you a little bit. And it's like, that's not a judgment against the book. That's a judgment against your expectations.
Yeah, and I do think there's something fair about that if you jump from directly, if you think this is what a Loeb and Sale book is supposed to be
exactly.
from Long
Which
Halloween.
which I think this was maybe, well, aside from the the all of the Long Halloween books, this was probably the other Loeb and Sale book I tried, or like the next one after that.
Okay.
Like I
Okay.
hadn't read Superman for All Seasons. I hadn't read Daredevil Yellow. Hadn't read any of the Marvel Colors. It was like Long Halloween, Haunted Night, Dark Victory, the Catwoman Rome one,
When in Rome. Yeah.
then this, and it was like, what just happened?
Yeah.
This is a totally, I mean, it's like a different genre without, while still both being superhero comics.
But again, now you see that Long Halloween, like that's actually the outlier in terms of the stories they're telling, because
and I'm glad it is what it is.
Oh yeah,
but I'm also really glad that Daredevil Yellow is what it is.
Yeah.
And by that logic, I need to accept Spider-Man Blue for what it is.
Yes, yeah. Doesn't mean you have to accept Hulk Gray and Captain America White. I think we can talk about those briefly because we've mentioned them enough and we've crapped on them enough. And I think
I haven't even read them. I can't even genuinely crap on them. I'm just secondhand.
Let me just say, because it should come as no surprise that the setup of those books are the exact same premise as what we have in Yellow and Blue, right? It's our main characters. It's Bruce Banner and it's Steve Rogers, and they're looking back on and reflecting on someone who in their life who they lost, and reflecting back on the early days of their career. So for Hulk, it was back when he was literally gray, not green, and looking back on Betty Ross, who had died at some point. I think she may or may not still be dead. I don't know. She became a Hulk at some point. Everyone became a Hulk at some point. I don't read Hulk. And for Steve Rogers, he's looking back on the early days when it was him and Bucky died. Which used to matter, which obviously doesn't anymore because the Winter Soldier exists and no one cares because the Winter Soldier is awesome. But for the longest time, everyone stays dead except for Uncle Ben and Bucky Barnes and Jason Todd. And, two of those guys came back in main continuity and they're arguably better characters now than they were when they first arrived. So the impact, I think, just it doesn't land as hard, especially not in my mind with Captain America, because like Bucky's back now. So like, all the regret he can have, everything he's trying to say to Bucky about those early days and all that, like he can have that conversation now. He doesn't need to write missives or record his thoughts now anymore. Like that's not important. He can talk to Bucky and be like, "Hey man, I screwed up back in the day." Like we shouldn't have had a literal child on the front lines with the super soldier.
It's
like
a weird choice.
Yeah, that wasn't the best idea. That was a little weird. Mistakes were made. So. And I just think there is the idea of applying that formula to other characters. Just I don't think it worked. I think with Daredevil it worked in a weird way because Karen in publication history had just died. It was fresh. It works with Spider-Man because the death of Gwen Stacy is such a monumental comics event. That was a big time major happening in comics. An iconic moment in comics, truly iconic moment in comics. The panel of her falling from the George Washington Bridge and all that. The deaths associated with Hulk and Captain America, like they're just not. Bucky's death was, but again, by the time Captain America White was coming out, like Bucky'd been back for a handful of years. The Winter Soldier existed. So I think that those stories just don't land as well, I don't think, because they're not pulling from as strong a source. I don't believe.
Yeah.
So there's an up and down nature to the work of Loeb and Sale in that way, because it's not just the formula. It's not just them applying their storytelling frame to a character. There has to be something more inherently in those characters, in those stories. And I think the Daredevil and Spider-Man ones were just, they have stronger source material that they're pulling from versus what you see with Cap and with Hulk, in my mind. I think that's, for me, why those first two work and the second two don't. But maybe if you talk to a devoted Hulk reader or even a devoted Cap reader, they maybe feel differently. But for me, I think the reason Spider-Man Blue specifically lands so hard is because my connection just to that character. And I think it does um, it does put a bias on the way I view this book, which is
Yeah,
something
I
that
mean,
you don't have.
right. Well, and I certainly wouldn't have it with Cap or Hulk
Yeah.
either. I think I think the thing is they're quasi period pieces. Like I think we were saying about Superman for All Seasons, he feels like a Superman born of the world that Superman was born in.
Yes.
Which was like,
Yes.
the Norman Rockwell
Late 30s, early 40s. Yeah.
late 30s, early 40s, but like the 50s ideal of America, like middle America,
Mhm.
like just that kind of hagiographic lens.
Yeah.
And I think when you go to do Captain America White, which by the way, I think it was so on the nose that we didn't even talk about the choice of the color blue for Spider-Man.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
It's
he
just
even talks
like,
about it. It's Valentine's Day. He's feeling
right.
sad. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas like the yellow was a little subliminal with Daredevil.
Mhm.
This one was on the nose. Captain America White, you assume, purity,
Yeah.
fidelity, something like
Yeah.
that.
And
And
again,
then you
gray
just think of
because
like,
gray
right,
because he,
and
he he
gray.
started out as gray. Initially, it was colored as gray. So yeah, there's
Right, but gray has, other meanings too, as does white. And I think the the big difference, what makes it probably a near miss, is like that era for Captain America is so oversaturated. Like,
yeah.
kind of that view of World War II. It's like they're
Mhm.
wearing the huge trousers and they're, doing this
Yeah.
and this, and they're going to fight on the Western Front. And
There's a
it's
greatest
like,
generation overload, especially in the early
yeah,
mid aughts. That we definitely, yeah, yeah,
well, it's because it was boomers' parents, and who made the
yeah,
most comics,
yeah,
probably even still, is boomers. Because
yeah.
there were
Well,
still boomers writing comics. There have been
yeah,
boomers writing comics since
there
the
are, yeah,
60s,
yeah, yeah,
and there are
yeah,
still boomers writing comics, meaning the overwhelming majority of comics are written by boomers.
yeah. Well, and
Um,
it's in the early, when Captain America White would have coming out, it would have been, I believe, at that point, the Greatest Generation book, the Tom Brokaw stuff had come out. Band of Brothers had come out, so that there had been Saving Private Ryan had come. All of that. You know, even like Pearl Harbor had been. So like there had been a new renewed interest in the idea of the American soldier at World War II. And so maybe doing a Cap story felt natural. It felt of the times. But, yeah, I think it's so trodden, it's so well trod path that yeah, it doesn't quite land because maybe there isn't as much new to say there, I guess.
right, yeah, I think that's what I'm
Yeah.
saying. And so
Yeah.
unless you're going to reinvent the wheel, which isn't
Yeah.
really what they're doing with the color
They're
series,
not, yeah, exactly. That's not the point.
there's just not a lot of breathing room there. But I think when the first two go so well, Daredevil and Spider-Man, it's like
Yeah.
Marvel was probably beating down the door, like, come on, you got to give us one more. Like, surely you got, a
Yeah.
Cap story. Like, I actually think like an Iron Man Red would have been a lot more interesting because
It,
he's a
it,
more complicated character.
it,
And,
it would have, except
if you did
again,
like, here's a revenge quest for Iron Man and he's angry and
yeah,
he's red, bam.
except in the early aughts, no one cared about Iron Man. Got to remember this. Before the Favreau movie, nobody cared
You
about
say
Iron Man.
that, but when we looked up the sales during Long Halloween, Iron Man was a top selling book
Yeah,
those
yeah,
months.
yeah,
I agree, no one in pop culture cared about him,
yeah.
but I also think Daredevil wasn't that much better off.
Oh no, in the moment he was, thanks to Marvel Knights, thanks to Kevin Smith having just
Yeah.
been on it. In the moment, he had just come up in that early part, which again, and even right after that, you had the terrible Affleck movie and all that stuff. So Daredevil was in a better place, I think, amongst comic readers because there was buzz around the Kevin Smith, Joe Quesada, David Mack, Jimmy Palmiotti book.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah,
fair.
yeah. So I think it Captain America White also took like 7-8 years to come out, almost 10 years. Like there was a zero issue, a preview issue that came out, and then it was almost like I think like almost 10 years fully before the book actually came out for real. It was so when it did come out, there was a lot of anticipation for it and it just wasn't very good. So yeah, it happens that yeah, of course, Marvel would have loved to have kept doing these books. I think they sold very well, and it makes for a nice collection, right? You can call it the Marvel Colors series, which is what they did. And I'm
Which
pretty
works a
sure that
lot better than the DC color series because you
yeah,
can't do Green Arrow green, Green
yeah,
Lantern green.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's
So
like
and
they
I'm
have too
pretty
many
sure
colors baked into the names. Black
yeah,
Lightning Black.
yeah, I'm sure you can there is I know there's a box set of all four of these. You can get them all in a nice,
It's just
kind
wild that that isn't like the norm availability. Like it's just
of,
not constantly reprinted that way.
well, yeah, I mean, because I think they just sell more Spider-Man Blue on its own than would any of those box sets. So, but yeah, I know they printed one. It probably only has the one printing though. So if you find it it would be at like a used bookstore or something like that. Because I don't think they've reprinted that box set multiple times. I want to say that came out in like, well, it would have been after whenever Spider-Man Captain America White was finished up. So it would have been 2016 or 17 probably before it came out. For all four of those books. But yeah, it's I know it's a nice box set. I've seen it. I remember seeing it. I don't have it because I don't have physical copies of the trades for gray and white, but because I got yellow and blue. Those are the ones that I love. Those are the ones that I go back to and will go back to and continue to go back. I mentioned in previous discussions here, I love Tim Sale's art so much that I will just flip through these books without having to read them again. And because how much I do love Spider-Man and the iconography around Spider-Man, this is one of my favorite books to flip through because I love Tim Sale's. I love his character design. You know, I
Yeah,
love the
I
way it
mean,
looks. I love the way he draws. He
and I do have
draws
to say,
all
I
the things.
loved the art that like the
Yeah,
splash pages of Spider-Man in this were
yeah,
so good. And I did like the coloring on those, like when it's all blue
yeah.
shading. But I will say
Oh, did we mention the colors? Oh, I don't know if we
we
did.
didn't, and I was just gonna say this is
Yeah,
not a
Steve
great time to
Buccellato.
mention. Yeah, it was
Yeah,
not a great time to mention because I was gonna say
yeah.
of the Loeb-Sale books, this coloring was my least favorite. Not bad, just
It had.
relatively uninspired
I would say
compared
weirdly,
to
it has the least amount of theme work to it, aside
yeah,
from the
right.
the
Aside from the
blue hue at
blue,
the
yeah,
end.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's less convention they're trying to do with it, and I think a lot of that is they're I don't know what version you read in the back of the version I have. There's like some sketch, they call it the sketchbook. There's stuff in the back from Tim Sale, and you can see some of the original panels that were done either like Steve Ditko or John Romita Sr. That they were trying to replicate or pay homage to. You can They have like cutouts of those panels in there, and you see what Tim Sale's his sketch was as kind of reference. And so I think they were really trying to hew to replicating a lot of the feel and the look. And I think that goes a long way with some of the colors as well, in terms of what they were trying to use and how they're trying to depict it. I think they were really trying to go out of their way to pay homage to those classic issues, which again I think were either Ditko or Romita Sr. So,
Yeah.
which is maybe why it feels less inspired because they're trying to specifically hit and do what was done before versus in the other three books that we talked about. There's a little more leeway because they're striving for something else.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's fair to
yeah,
say.
yeah.
But
Well, no,
all of
I
this
think
to
your criticism
say,
is fair as well because yeah,
but it wasn't bad. It was just uninspired. It was my
yes,
take.
yeah. Well,
But
again, I think that's
as
fair,
you were
definitely.
talking about, um, Mary Jane's entrance into ASM 42, I
Yes,
actually pulled that up on my computer. There's like
yes,
websites where you can just go
yeah,
read the whole thing. It's
mhm,
not how I would read it. I would
yeah,
pay someone's
yeah,
licensing rate, but I just pulled it up for a page by page comparison. And as I was scrolling to the end of that issue to see the Mary Jane introduction and the iconic line, I was like, okay, well, they did kind of like nail the colors in terms of like creating the vibe of that era.
yes,
So it's like I think he was like, well, we're reconstructing the original story. The men are wearing suits and ties. Let's do the colors the way they were done. Let's
yes,
let's
yes.
limit the color palette
Mhm.
to what they had back then and do it flat and not watercolored like Superman for All Seasons, which you could
Yeah,
never have printed
yeah,
basically before
yeah.
they printed Superman for All Seasons. Like
Well,
that
yeah.
was relatively new printing technology and it's a bit of a flex.
And I think you're right when you mentioned when we talked about that. It's trying to invoke a vibe. It's trying to invoke that Norman Rockwellian vibe.
Yes.
So it's less about what the comic books looked like in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and more about what they felt like.
Yes.
And what we now think about that time frame. That's what they're trying to replicate there. With Daredevil Yellow, they're doing all sorts of things, like when it goes monochrome and things like they're really trying to do things with shadow and light, more so than what they
And
did
lots
in.
of yellow hue. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
lots of overlay. And then anytime yellow's in a scene, it's important,
Yes,
right?
it
It's like
pops.
it's
Yeah,
popping out.
yeah. Is it on
It's drawing
Karen's
your eye
dress?
to
Is it? Yes, yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah. And I think you're right. They are taking less chances with Spider-Man Blue because they are, I do believe, making an intentional try to replicate the look and feel as much of those original books as they were printed, just with updated art and character design from a different artist. But they were trying to really get the feel of this is what it would have looked like, if you read those comics back in the day. I think they were trying, that's what their intention was, as opposed to trying to put their spin on it. They were trying to make that homage deliberate and.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, ending on a positive note, like, this book turned me around on second read. Getting a wider context for Loeb-Sale helped. And then the conversation pushed me a notch further. So I hope if there are any listeners who were lukewarm on the book, they hung with us for, that 90-minute discussion here on 6 issues of Spider-Man. But I do think it's warranted for a book of this gravity, for a character like we are not gonna have another excuse to talk about Spider-Man on this podcast.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Given that we cover indie creator-owned books, we're taking an exception for this creative team who basically only does superhero books. So this was our chance to talk about Batman. This was our chance to talk about Spider-Man and Superman. And it's really funny to me that like we broke the rule, and the fourth exception was Daredevil.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like
yeah.
if if people said like, oh, you're gonna do 4 non-indie books, Superman, Batman, obviously, Spider-Man, way up at the list.
Well, and
Uh,
if we had told them, two DC, two Marvel,
right,
if
yeah,
we told
I
them
think
that,
they'd have 10 guesses before they got to Daredevil. As our
probably,
yeah,
yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
but if they figured out the Loeb-Sale theme, then it's probably a
Yeah,
little
they
shorter.
narrows it down. Yeah, definitely, definitely. But I think I want to revisit. Well, I want to do two things. The first thing I want to revisit is, as we kind of wrap up Loeb and Sale here. I mentioned, I think back in the zero, that I felt that these are as these feel like independent comics, even though they're both, even though they're released through the big two and they're superhero books. And they're obviously not, because they're for hire works, for established characters. What I meant by that, or I think what I've tried to say that is, they feel like independent comics in terms of the way that we view independent comics now. They didn't feel like independent comics so much when they were being released at the time, because our understanding of what an indie comic is and a creator comic is has shifted over the years, in the past 30 some odd years, since like Image came into being, and redefined what we thought an indie comic was. It's only in hindsight, when we look back on the work that Loeb and Sale did, the idea that they're doing these stories that are, again, quote unquote, in continuity, but they're not happening concurrently. They're miniseries or standalone. You don't have to reading what's going on in the main story to understand it. It's just, here's a story, here's a Peter Parker story, here's a Matt Murdock story, it's a Clark Kent story, here's a Bruce Wayne. They're standalone, but they're part of the world, but they're not happening at the same time. And so it gives them a lot of freedom, again, to do their own, make their own storytelling choices in the way they want to, which is what you see creators do with their own books all the time. When they're free of those bounds of what we'll call continuity and house style and things of that nature. When these guys came onto the scene, they were doing something that no one else was doing. And now mainstream comics at Marvel and DC look a hell of a lot more like the stuff that Loeb and Sale were doing 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
The mainstream business looks a lot more like the books they were doing now than the stuff that that was mainstream back in the 90s and early aughts. The things that they were doing are much more embraced now at Marvel and DC than when Loeb and Sale were at their height. So it's cool to look back at them now, with the eyes we have of seeing how books look now. Because again, a book that looked like this from an artist like Tim Sale would not stand out on the shelves the way that they did back when they first were coming out in the 90s and early aughts.
Yeah.
It's much less radical now because it's much more the norm. So
Yeah.
it's been fun to go back and look at that stuff.
I mean, it's like a double layer history of comics for me. I'm getting the history of the 2000s, like
Mm-hmm.
late 90s, early 2000s comics, which is before my era, although it's when I started to like become aware of comics
Of
because
comic,
of
yeah, comic
movies.
properties, yeah, yeah.
Um, and then I'm also getting the history of like, the silver age
Mm,
of these silver and golden age for some of these
yeah.
characters. I think probably Daredevil is probably bronze age as far back as he goes, but it's like,
Yeah, late. I think late silver. To mid.
but
I got to look at
basically,
the
if you
dates
read these
exactly. Yeah.
four books with us and looked up the source material they were based on, I think you would touch every decade of comics from 30s to when ththese books were written.
Pretty
I think
close.
you touch like 30s with Superman stuff, 30s, 40s with Superman stuff, uh, you know, 60s, 70s with Spider-Man stuff. I don't know
60s,
exactly when
70s,
42 is happening.
70s for the
You
Daredevil
definitely hit
stuff. 60s,
80s
70s.
in the Daredevil stuff.
Yeah, and then
I think
the
Karen died
Batman.
in 80s.
Yeah, and then was that?
I think Karen died in the 80s, right?
No, Karen died in the 90s.
Oh, in the
So
90s.
yeah, so
Right.
that
Oh,
would have
well,
just happened
that's
there.
another decade.
And
Yeah.
then but Long Halloween harkens back to year one, which is from the 80s. That's post crisis. So you're talking about 80s and in the 90s there. So yeah, you're spanning most the entire history of comics through these books here. And whether or not you know them all,
Which
whether or not
it's
you've read
pretty
them all.
cool, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah,
like
yeah.
I didn't even think of that as like a sales pitch for this series, but now I will. Now I'll spin it
Yeah.
as like this is like a history of where comics have been and really where they're going. Because
Yes.
now when I read so many
Yeah.
other people's treatments, especially like, you know, I just started I finally I'm not current, but I finally read the first trade of like Tom King's Wonder Woman,
Yeah.
and it's like this is so Loebian.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
it's
So without spoiling anything, someone is talking about the events from a future time period.
right.
So you're watching Wonder Woman in this moment deal with everything she's dealing with, and there is a narrator of someone in the position of the future
And like
talking
Superman
about.
for all seasons, you never
Yes,
get in the character's head. It is someone else observing the character.
yes, yeah, yeah, talking
Um,
talking about her, talking about the events. Yeah, and said you cannot read anything that Tom King does now and not feel like, oh yeah, he is from the Jeph Loeb coaching tree, directly down from that. He is doing the thing. I believe at a higher, a little more evolved level. Than Loeb had done. But it's that same setup where there's some sort of narration. Someone is narrating, whether it could be inner monologue, it could be a third party viewing it, but that idea of heavy narration, whether it's one of his mini series, whether it's an ongoing like Wonder Woman is right now, he's doing with Daniel Semperi. It is his style. That is clearly aped from Jeph Loeb. So just that idea that it's become you can do that in an ongoing. It doesn't have to be a miniseries anymore. That's just
right.
how a book you can be. And there are other authors and other creators that have worked in the same way on at both Marvel and DC. And so you're right. These books span back to the origins of these characters, which means they go back to the origin of comics. But they have now become predictive of where comics are now, which we didn't know at the time. We didn't know in the mid 90s to early aughts when these books were coming out that this is where mainstream comics would go. But looking back from our position now, we can obviously see the influence these books have had on just the regular books you get every week from Marvel. And this has become the norm. It's become this.
Yeah, it makes it a great time to read this.
Yeah.
And I will go back to what I said at the beginning for the reasons that I think we've unearthed as we went here. I would not give this book to someone who's brand new to reading Spider-Man.
So that was my second point I wanted to revisit because I've been thinking
Okay.
about that the entire episode as we've been talking. And
I'm wrong?
no, I think I agree with you.
Yeah, okay.
But
Okay.
but I've been thinking about what is the Spider-Man story? Is there a standalone Spider-Man story I would give to someone and say, read this as a miniseries? And I'm honestly struggling to think of the best one.
Congratulations, because I went into a comic shop 2 years ago. I went in
Yeah.
two comic shops.
Mhm.
I'm not going to shout them out because their answers are embarrassing, but I said, look, my friend, I just got her into the MCU. She binged all of them. She house sat for me for 2 weeks, used my Disney Plus account, binged every MCU movie
That's a
in
fantastic use of house sitting, by the way. That's
in a
great.
2 week, yeah, in a 2 week stint, and uh was like, oh my god. And then she listened to binge mode,
Mhm.
which the combination of MCU and binge mode is just sublime.
Yeah.
But she was like, I want to get into comics. She like started to root through my boxes upstairs, and but like doesn't even know how to read a comic. Like it finds it counterintuitive. She's like, I want to get into it. She loved hearing Jason talk about it. And so I went for Christmas to go get her a Spider-Man book. She said Spider-Man was her favorite character based on Tom Holland's portrayal. No shade there. Like
Okay.
pretty great choice. And I went into two different comic shops and I said, I have a friend who's never read a comic book before. Like not even as a kid, not comic strips, never read a comic book, loves Spider-Man. What do I give her?
So
And they were all stumped. I ended up
that
buying Ultimate Spider-Man, like the original Ultimate Spider-Man.
so and in that specific case for your friend, that's exactly what I would have said, because that's an easy answer for me. For someone in that specific mold, you get them the original Ultimate Spider-Man, Brian Michael Bendis, Mark Bagley.
Yep.
You start them on that and say, this is the Spider-Man you want to read, because the MCU Spider-Man pulls so much from that idea, from that story. So that one is easy. That's what I would have said there. When we're talking about of like, hey, just to give, if I want to give someone a general story, a Spider-Man story, I don't know what I would think of in the same way that I would like, hey, just read Superman for all seasons. Just read Batman Long Halloween. I don't know if there's a Spider-Man story like that. My fallback, my go-to really is read Ultimate Spider-Man. Read the original Ultimate Spider-Man. Read this. If you get into this and read the first trade of it and you like what you're, if you can get with the way that Bendis does story and all that, if you can get with this now, and especially now that it's almost 25 years old, if you can still get with this, read Ultimate Spider-Man, you'll understand who Peter Parker is. Even if you're not reading 616, you'll get it, and that's a story you can read. So that absolutely would have been my recommendation to you at that point. But I cannot think of a book, a self-contained one-story book like Superman for All Seasons or something like that, that I would give to someone just for Spider-Man. Maybe I would give them on the most recently it was Superman Life Story. That was Chip Zdarsky and oh, the artist is
Yeah,
escaping me
well, and
right
I
now.
think these
But
like
but
these
that
like year
also
one type
requires,
books try to be their,
yeah,
or
yeah.
it's like, what was the oversized Superman that came out on DC Black Label that was supposed to be like a new like telling of the origin story? It was like Superman Year One. It's something really
Oh yeah,
delicious
yeah.
or
That was
whatever.
terrible though. That was what Frank Miller
Uh,
and Johnny Mooney Jr. on that.
right, but that's like what they were
Yeah,
going for, right?
yeah,
There's
but
like,
but yeah,
this
yeah,
is
but
going
that
to
yeah,
be you give this to someone who wants to read Superman book,
yeah. No, that
and it just
that's a
didn't
lot.
work.
Yeah, give them for all seasons. So yeah, I don't know what I would give to someone who wanted a self-contained like one story Spider-Man story. Although at this point, honestly, I would probably give someone the original Spider-Verse, the 2014. Just read this one, because so many people now know and understand multiverse stories
What a
through
Spider Verse is, yeah.
because of Spider-Man, because of Into the Spider-Verse. Although they'd be shocked at that first one, they'll realize that like Miles is barely in it, because in 2015, like Miles barely existed. When that story happened, he still was in the Ultimate Universe. Secret Wars hadn't happened yet. Secret Wars 3 hadn't happened yet, at least. But yeah, if you wanted to start reading Spider-Man and never read it before, I would tell someone the original Ultimate Spider-Man. But for someone like you who has some knowledge and it is already reading comics, I would say either the 2014, 2013, the Dan Slott run, with I guess that's with Roberto Ramos on that one, or the Nick Spencer, Ryan Otley one in 2017 and 2018, I think. Any one of those starts, I think, are in the past 10 years are worthwhile. You can jump in and start reading it. You could even start with the Zeb Wells, Johnny Meter Jr. That was just a year or so ago. Kind of the most current reboot, I guess, restart is the Zeb Wells one. So yeah, any of those for someone who's already a comic reader, you can jump right in. I think you can, and as long as you have some knowledge, just like a character like Batman, you know who Peter Parker is, you know his origin story, you know the basics just because of pop culture osmosis. So you can jump in at any point and read it. But I think talking to you though throughout this, I think I have a greater appreciation for the depths at which Spider-Man Blue is intentionally paying homage to what came before, and how knowing that, having read it, even though I read it after the fact, and having a little more respect and more esteem for that does really color the way I read this book now, because there is so much intention there. And then if it is your first Spider-Man story, I can see how that can be lost on someone. So I gaining that perspective from talking to you, I think has been helpful, because now I think I agree with you. There's a higher risk to give this as someone's first Spider-Man.
Yeah, well, especially if the oldest Spider-Man you know is Tobey Maguire.
Yeah.
Um, that's still relatively modern compared to this book. In terms of like how it's set, you know, where the characters are, you know, societal norms. And like, you know, I rewatched the Tobey Maguire ones, still love them, no shade. But like MJ is exclusively damsel in distress.
Yeah.
Like she has no other personality, plot, or function.
Yeah.
He is just somehow always on top of a building falling. Like 3 movies in a row. Really unreal.
It's tough. It's of its time.
Can we get her a parachute? Like that's like just like get her some kind of technology. Like if you're such a great you know, scientist, maybe a little prevent defense if this is gonna keep happening.
Or just
like,
stay away from balconies, you know, just
stay away from balconies.
Stay on the ground floor. It's all good.
To be fair, like Doc Ock carrying her up a building and then Harry carrying her up a building.
That's true.
It's like it's there's
it
gotta
is
be
New York. You don't have a
something.
Choice sometimes. Yeah.
Right. They need what's the thing from Dark Knight? Skyhook that the CIA invented in the 70s. just constantly have a little drone or plane flying around ready to like scoop her up when she starts falling. Anyway, well, I really loved this discussion. I mean, all of them. I'm sad to be leaving these creators behind for now. I think we reserve the right to return to them whenever we feel like it, but we'll try to show great restraint. I think it's an unspoken rule in the podcast that we try not to cover the same artist or writer in a 12-month window. Like, you know, we don't constantly run back to Ed Brubaker or Jeph Lemire.
Yeah,
because
if we didn't, we would only do Lemire,
Brubaker podcast.
Brian K. Vaughan. Yeah, we would do this. Yeah, we do try to mix it up, but we have to be ourselves, and so at the first opportunity to track back on someone we love, we'll do it. It takes great restraint on both of our parts to not just only talk about the creators that we love.
Yeah. That said, I have found a lot of new creators. You know, that I'm very excited about, and they're quickly elevating themselves to the level of Lemire in my mind, because I've spent so much time digging into their work, and like, you know, like Pornsack is one right now that like I liked The Good Asian a lot. When we spoke to him on this podcast, I was like, auto pull everything he does. First of all, he's a wingnut. Secondly, he's just like hilarious, thoughtful, intelligent, kind person that you just want to support. You know, Gailey, I think, has like a great mind for sci-fi, that Mark Russell wit. You know, and these are people who like don't need my endorsement in any way, because they're all doing great. They're all winning awards now.
But
I just named
for you,
Eisner, Hugo. You know, it's like those are. So just a lot of great. It's a great time to be a comic reader. That's what I'm trying to say.
It is. It is. You, when you came in to start reading comics, you know, a handful of some odd years ago, you came in at really like legitimately no better time in the history of comics. Have comics been as good across the board as when you have been reading?
Well, that's the problem. It's like every time I try to go backward and read things,
Yeah.
It feels like a falling off a cliff. A lot
Well,
of
that's
times,
what
especially
you have to skip the 90s. You have to if you want to go back in time, you can go back in into the early aughts. That's fine.
right. I was
and
like,
then
80s
jump.
had a lot of camp too.
But it depends on what you pick up. But you got to jump on the 90s, skip the 90s, and go into the 80s. There's some really good stuff. You know, especially that if you know you wanted your superhero stuff, 80s was still pretty good. Just act like the 90s didn't happen. Skip over that and work your way backwards from there. And just understand that comic publishing was different back in the day. But you're right. Now is the best time that comics have never been better across the medium because of
this should be referred to as the golden age. Like, I know the name's taken, but this is truly the golden age of comics. Like,
because
there's never been more diverse voices.
And
there have never been so many niche publishers. Like
every genre, any type of character, people who are creating the books. So meaning you don't have to read the bad stuff because there's still bad stuff. Let's be very clear about this.
Oh, there's just as much bad stuff as there's ever been.
Yeah, but there's more good stuff as opposed to like in the 90s when all you had was what was there. And so if it was good, you read it. If it was bad, you read it because that's all there was. You didn't have any options. Now you've got a ton of options. And so that's why I think it's been fun these past few weeks to go back and read these books from a time when comics were struggling. I mean, they just in general, the industry was struggling. You know, mid 90s when starting back when Long Halloween was coming out, like we're coming, you know, the industry cratered, you know, in that time period. Again, Marvel filing bankruptcy and coming out of it. Late 90s, early aughts were a fraught time for the industry. And when I came back was just after that, you know, just after they had kind of pulled themselves out from the depths and started working their way back up. So it wasn't necessarily the lowest point, but you know, it was on upward trend, but nowhere near where it's become in the past 20 years. So yeah, there are so many people out there now. You know, we want to try to highlight as many as we can. We want to find people that I hadn't read before, you know, books that I had seen but never picked up. This is an excuse to jump into them and find some of those next great favorite creators, whether it's a writer or an artist or whatever. That's what we're trying to do. And like you, I found so many writers and artists that now just when they put a book out, it's just auto subscribe, you know. I don't need to see any more other than their name on the book. And that's enough for me to go. That's enough for me to be all in. And that list just keeps growing more and more. The more that we read, the more that we talk about them.
Yeah. And talk to them.
Yes.
Which is,
if we're lucky enough. Yeah.
Great privilege. So anyway, thank you for listening. We will be back with another great book, a new creative team, something we don't even know yet at this point that we're recording.
We're still throwing it out there. So.
Which I think is the first time we've ended our current recording series without having an inkling of what's next.
It's been a while. We go back to the early, maybe the first year, less than a year, 8 months.
Yeah,
when we haven't had any idea when we completely wung it. But
we're not out of ideas. We're like, we have 6 months worth of stuff in the hopper. We just haven't decided which thing's next or something's going to leapfrog all that. So anyway,
next
we're just excited to find out.
Surprise to you, surprise for us.
Right, for everyone. So anyway, thanks for listening, and we will see you then.
Peace.